starting, I just wanted to give a quick rundown of the definitions in PIAAC, and specifically that of literacy. So PIAAC defines literacy as understanding, evaluating, using and engaging with written text, both print and digital, to participate in society, to achieve one's goals, and to develop one's knowledge and potential. So PIAAC was much less about writing and more about answering multiple choice questions, highlighting information to be used in practical settings. All right, so if we look at the relationship between education and skills, we see that educational attainment has a strong influence on proficiency. The proficiency level of Canadians with a university degree are on par with those of their counterparts in the OECD. And finally, there's a clear relationship between participation in adult learning and proficiency. But it's interesting to note that those who could benefit most from adult learning aren't always those that access it. And I'm going to go into a bit more detail on that in the next couple of slides. So here, generally speaking, we see that higher educational attainment is associated with stronger scores in literacy. So these are the two bars, so the light blue line and the dark blue line. The dark blue line represents the OECD average score in literacy, and the light blue line is the Canadian average in literacy. And so you can see at each level of education, Canada's scores are slightly below the OECD. However, the gap is virtually non-existent at the university level. So if you see here on the right-hand side at the top, there is virtually no difference between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. All right, Canadians with post-secondary education below bachelor's degree perform 8 points below the OECD average in literacy. And so what do I mean by post-secondary education below bachelor's degree? So this includes non-university certificates, college diplomas, and trade and vocational certifications. On the right-hand side, you see post-secondary bachelor's degree or higher. And so Canadians with this level of education perform only 2 points below the OECD average, and this is not statistically significant. If we look at the average score of populations aged 16 to 65 by educational attainment and age, we see that not only do Canadians with higher levels of education have higher literacy scores, but that advantage persists across all age cohorts. Okay, so there's a lot going on in this graph, but this chart shows the rate of participation in adult education by skill level in different countries. So each bar or each shape represents a different skill level. So you have below level 1, which is the red circle, level 2, 3, and then 4 and 5 at the top. So across all countries, higher skills translates into higher participation in adult education. And here it's worth noting that those who could most benefit from adult education, so those at levels below level 1 and level 1, aren't necessarily those who are accessing it, because their participation rates are actually lower than those at the higher ends of the spectrum, levels 4 and 5, who tend to participate in adult education more frequently. If we look at language, the proportion of the population whose mother tongue, so their first language, is different from that of the language of assessment is higher in Canada than in any other country. Next, Canadian immigrants whose mother tongue is neither English nor French perform better than foreign-born respondents in almost all other countries. So those are the main takeaway points. If we look in more detail, so it's quite small on your screen here. You can maybe see it on your printout. So Canada has the highest proportion of the population whose first language is not the same as the test language. So Canada here in red on the left-hand side of the screen is at 23%. This is compared to the OECD average of 9%. And you can see that Nova Scotia is just below the OECD at 8%. Interestingly, literacy scores for Canadian adults whose first language is not the same as the test language are significantly higher than the OECD average. So Canada, the average score of this group is 256 in Canada, whereas it's 246 in the OECD. I'm going to skip this slide. So if we look at language minority communities, we see that generally speaking, Anglophones tend to outperform Francophones in minority settings. But what's interesting here is that there's a great deal of provincial variation in terms of performance. So if you look on the screen, New Brunswick, there's a 15-point gap between Anglophones and Francophones, whereas in Manitoba with 280, the scores are identical. If we look at immigrants, we see that Canada is one of only a few countries whose immigrant population is both proportionately larger than average and more proficient than average. Next, while there is a skills gap between immigrant and non-immigrants, the gap in Canada is relatively narrow compared to other countries. Also, what's important for immigrants is that educational attainment doesn't always translate into proficiency in literacy in the official language of the new country. And finally, immigrants who receive a significant portion of their education in Canada are much less likely to be at a disadvantage in terms of their skills. So in this chart, we have literacy, numeracy, and problem-solving scores that are broken down into 3 categories. So you see in gray is the recent immigrant category. So those are those who have been in Canada less than 10 years. In green, we have the established immigrants who have been in Canada more than 10 years, and then the Canadian-born are in blue. So you can see that, that Canadian-born populations tend to perform better than immigrants, both recent and established, across all 3 domains. However, what's interesting, and I know that Frank noted this in his presentation, is that there's really little difference between recent and established immigrants. Which suggests that the length of time that immigrants are in Canada doesn't necessarily have a huge impact on their skills. But what's important to note here, I think, is that many immigrants in Canada are writing the PIAAC assessment in their non-native language, which puts them at a significant disadvantage. And so I think that that's really important to take advantage, or to take into account when we're analyzing the results in PIAAC. All right, foreign-born Canadians perform better than average in literacy when compared to their foreign-born peers in other OECD countries. Also, the gap between native and foreign-born adults is less in Canada than in many other countries. If we look at Aboriginal peoples, so Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people with similar levels of education have similar skills proficiency. So education has proven to be a key to eliminating this skills gap. So the so-called skills gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people is wider among younger adults than it is among older populations. And finally, the skills gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people varies considerably by region and by the type of skill assessed. All right, so here's another table. There's a lot going on in this table. But as you can see with the two blue lines, there are only very small differences between scores of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal populations when looked at by education level. And in fact, at the university level, Aboriginal populations score 5 points higher in literacy compared to non-Aboriginal populations. So again, this speaks to the importance of education in skills development. However, it's also important to note that it's an attainment issue, so that inequality continues to persist in Canada because there's a much smaller proportion of the population, of the Aboriginal population, that actually achieve a bachelor's degree or higher compared to the non-Aboriginal population. So if you see on the right-hand side here, the gray bar represents the proportion of non-Aboriginal participants in PIAAC that completed a bachelor's degree or higher, and then that's actually 11% for Aboriginal people. So you can see there's a huge discrepancy there. All right, this already speaks to something we already know, but across the age spectrum, in general, non-Aboriginal people tend to outperform their Aboriginal counterparts. So this is true at all age levels. If we look at the distribution of skills, we see that Canada has a higher than average proportion of its population at both the high and low ends of the proficiency scales. So Canada has a lot of strong performers, but also has a lot of weak performers. Higher levels of proficiency are associated with positive social and economic outcomes. So highly literate adults are more likely to be in good health, to be employed, to participate in volunteer activities, and to have higher wages. And this slide is actually for all of the OECD and not specific to Canada. You may ask, who are the Canadians performing at the lowest proficiency levels? So this table looks at different segments or categories in the population who perform at level 1 or below in each of the 3 domains, so literacy, numeracy, and problem solving in technology-rich environments. So there are a number of categories there, you can probably see them in front of you, but what's interesting about this is that the proportion with the lowest skills are actually the Canadians with less than a high school attainment. So you see that 41% of Canadians who participated in PIAAC have low literacy levels, 51% have low numeracy levels, and 22% have low problem solving. And this, again, is above our 4 participants who did not achieve high school. All right, if we look at the skills gaps, if we compare actually the skills gaps in literacy, we see that the gaps within countries are much larger than actually the gaps between them. The largest gap on the slide here is actually between high and low performing Canadians in literacy. So, and this can be kind of counterintuitive because sometimes we think that the gaps are biggest between countries or between provinces, and in PIAAC that's not the case. The largest gaps are those between the high and low performing Canadians in literacy. And so on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Karen, who's going to speak to the results in Nova Scotia. Thank you.